In part 2, we're going to look at this stairs collection of objects, which is part of an architectural scene. We're going to focus on the use of collection instances, the duplicate linked command, and object-on-object instancing. And you're going to note that one of the features of the stairs is that the wood texture sort of randomly repeats across each of the stair instances. That's going to be a featuring aspect that helps us to determine how to structure this setup. Let's go ahead and open up the start file. And I've got a couple of pieces of geometry here that indicate sort of the floor levels. There's the mid-level between the two floor levels, and then there's the lower floor level. These are just indicators. So let's go ahead and turn those off. And then I've got two empties that indicate where two general stair sections go. So for right now, we're going to focus down on the actual stair geometry. And we've got this support strut component, and we've got some bolts. Right now, we only have one bolt. And this is going to be our starting point. So the first thing that we need to do is come over and just look at the components and start organizing these into collections, because collections are an organizational function in Blender. In and of themselves, they don't have any representations in the 3D geometry until you create an instance, but it is important to structure things correctly. If we come over to the outliner, I've already got a major collection in place called stairs section. So that's going to be our starting point, because we need to think about the thing that we're going to reference into another scene. So we have sort of a master collection that gets imported into the other scene. And so that's what I've set up. I'm going to have us then come in. So we've got bolt, we've got grip, we've got these two stair empties. We're going to leave those outside, but I'm going to select all of these, and I'm going to deselect just those. So these are all the components of just the stair, and let's create a new collection for these. So I'm going to press M, and then we'll do new, and we'll just call this stair for right now. We can always change it, and I want to put this back inside of stair sections. The next thing that I want to reference is where my center point is. So when we start replicating items, regardless of the method in this case, we want to be cognizant of where the reference point is for all of this replication happening. I'm going to have this cross-section point at the center of the stair be our main reference point. That's where the main empty is that I've placed for where this lower stair assembly is going to be. Our starting point now to finally get in and begin working with this is to focus on this strut support object over here. So we need to replicate some of these bolts, and we need to begin asking ourselves, are we going to be replicating or duplicating a single object? Yes. Do we want that duplicate to be a brand new object unlinked from the original? No. Do we need the duplicate to still be linked to the original as an instance? Yes. And then the next question is this going to be something that we need to texture independently from the other instances? No, this is going to be a simple instance duplication. So in that case, that means that we can use option D for duplicate linked. That also gives us the ability to use an array modifier. Since we're going to be using the simple duplicate linked function, I want to manipulate the object directly. I'm going to press the period key, and we're going to change the pivot point so it's linked to the active object. We want to take a note that right up here, it says the orientation is local, and we want to change this back to default. Just make sure the default is there. And that will mean that if you look here, it'll use whatever the transform orientations is. Now, this can be a little bit confusing because there are two of these. There's transform orientations and there's orientations here. This is simply a temporary override that allows you to set this depending on the object that you have set. But if you leave it at default, it's simply going to use what the transform orientation is. So these just will pop up and be the default behavior unless you override them on a tool by tool basis. So we're going to leave it at global, which means that the pivot point just aligns itself to the global X, Y, and Z coordinate system. Doesn't matter what the orientation of the object is, and that can be very useful. But in this particular case, we want to move this down along a particular angle. So what I'm going to do is select this object and then press the Tab key to go into edit mode. By default, I'm in edge, and I'm going to select this particular edge. I'm going to switch over into move, and we want to come over and change this so that the pivot is following that edge vector. So we're going to come down to normal. Notice how it's now aligned the local Y to that edge. But we need to set that in a way that other objects can use it. So we come over and press plus. It creates a new custom orientation, and that's all we need to do. It's now selected. Pressing the Tab key leaves that edit mode, and we can select this object. And now I can press Option D, which is just coming up here to duplicate linked, and it's going to freeform move it, but we want to move it in a constrained way along that local Y axis. Press Y, and look at that. Now I can just click right there, and then I can press Shift and R to replicate that to the new location. And then you can play if you want to space these out, then these are very easy to space out along that surface. And now we have this surface that we want to place one of these bolts along, or actually 3 of those bolts. I want to place it right here. So we need to take a duplicate, but we need to create a position for it in that location. So I've just clicked with the 3D cursor to that location. It is important that you press the N key to make sure our options are available over here. And under Tool, for orientation, let's go ahead and set it so that the 3D cursor becomes aligned to the geometry. Just click again to make sure that that happens. Now, Option D for duplicate linked, Shift S, and then do a selection to cursor's location. Then, under Object, come down to Transform, and then Align to Transform Orientation. And then we need to come and set it so that it aligns to the 3D cursor. There we go, which in and of itself is aligned to the geometry. I want to move a duplicate of this down along the local orientation. So let's change the transform orientation to local, and then Option D. I want to move it along the X. Tap X once, and we'll just move it right to about that location. Press Shift and S, and we're going to do cursor to selected. I only needed that for position information, so I'm going to delete that, making sure that stair is my collection that I want an empty to drop into. Press Shift and A, and then we're going to add a plain empty there. It's pretty enormous, so I'm going to set it to 1, but I want it to be aligned to the 3D cursor. Now we can use this as a reference, but let's name this. Let's call this bolt position 1. And then we can use that as a reference for the replication function. So with the original selected, come down to modifiers. So remember, modifiers can only operate on single objects. They can't operate on collection instances or groups of items. So you have to keep in the decision-making process for replicating. Let's come over here to modifiers, and we're going to add array. It's going to go into the default position, but I want to move it up to the top. Let's come in and give it a value of 3, but we don't want it to be a relative offset. We want it to be offset by the object that we've placed in here. So we're going to click the little eyedropper and sample that right there. So there we go. So that's another way of doing it. Now that we've gotten that set up in place, we need to replicate it to the other side. But in order to do that, we need to consider the fact that we're now going to be working with a group of objects that we need to duplicate. So when we're working with a group of objects, we come down to our options. Is it a group of items that need to be duplicated? Yes. So in this particular case, we could do a collection instance of a collection. We could use a parenting mechanism, meaning you parent one object or multiple objects to one object, and then you could make them behave as a group. I think using a collection instance is the best because we're not going to be doing anything else to it apart from duplicating it. We don't need to worry about accessing any of the individual components. We don't need to worry about texturing any of the individual components separately. It's a simple group that we're going to replicate. So a collection instance is the way that we want to go. So we need to actually create a collection for these items. We have stairs, which is what we've created to encompass all the components of the stairs. But now we need to take all the bolts and the bolt position plus what I'm calling a support strut. So I'm going to press M. Let's create a new collection inside of stair section. We'll call this bolts and strut. There we go. And it needs to come inside of stair. Anytime you create a collection instance, the single most important thing that you want to think about at the very beginning is where the center of that collection instance is going to be. By default, if we come over here and we select bolts and strut, if we come down to the collection properties function, under instancing, you're going to note that the instance offset says 0, 0, 0. Let's just see what happens if we create an instance. So I'm going to right click here, do an instance to scene, and you're going to note that we see this parent empty appear where the position of the 3D cursor is. But when we pull way back, you're going to note that the actual object is way up here. And that can be a little bit confusing. What's happening is it's placing the center of the object way down at the 0, 0, 0 position of the 3D universe and then offsetting the instance from that. And that's not what we want to happen. So I'm going to press the X key to delete that. Let's zoom back in, press Shift and S, do a cursor to selected, and it's going to move the 3D cursor to the origin of that strut component. That's a good place for the center of the collection instance. We need to come over now to instancing for this bolts and strut collection, down here to instancing, and we need to say set offset from the cursor, and it's going to put in new positions there. Now when we come over to bolts and strut, let's do a instance to scene, and there we go. So that's much more manageable. It still puts in a gigantic empty, so let's put this into 1 inch. Now we need to mirror this to the other side. So how do we go ahead and do that? Because we don't have a mirror function, we don't have access to any modifiers, but this is actually very easy to do. The symmetry point is right here, so I'm going to press Shift and S, do cursor to selected. Now, when I select bolt and strut collection instance, we can mirror it across there by using a scaling function. But we need to press the period key to move the selected object's pivot temporarily to the 3D cursor position. Press S and X, it will scale just along the x-axis, and type in -1, click, and it puts that over to the other side. So there we go. So everything has jumped to the other side, but we can still just control one set of objects over here. So we're now ready to replicate and create the actual stairs because we've got the components all in place. We basically have two types of repeating objects right here. We have one, which is the stair itself, that will need to vary. So we ask ourselves, is it a single object? Yes. So we're going to use duplicate linked, and that will give us the ability then to independently texture the instances. So we can't use any kind of a modifier, which wouldn't give us that ability. The first thing that we need to do is kind of separate these in the collection over here in sort of a visible way that's going to give us an easy way of understanding these components. So I'm going to come back to stairs here, and I'm going to add two more collections. One is called changing parts. The other is called non-changing parts. Non-changing parts are the grip, the bolt strut instance, and then the bolts and strut collection itself. When we replicate those, there's nothing that's going to change about them. We don't need to think about that kind of flexibility, so a collection instance is going to work well for that. And then the step itself is going to be a changing part, and so for organizational purposes alone, that's going to go inside of that collection. So let's start off with the non-changing parts, which is going to be a collection instance. We need to make sure, again, that the 3D cursor is in this reference location that we're using. And then we come over with it selected down to the collection properties function. We need to set the offset from the cursor's position. Okay, nothing visibly changes, but it puts those values there. And then come back up here and do an instanced scene of those parts. So how do we then replicate so that we have 8 or 9 stairs? And this is where we're going to do something really clever. We're going to start off with this step geometry, and I'm going to press the tab key and come in here in vertex mode with that center point that we're using as a reference, selecting that, and I'll press Shift and D to duplicate that point. Escape returns it to its original position, but now we can bring up the context menu and we can separate that to become its own object. Now press the period key over here in the outliner and that will reveal it. It's the duplicate object right here. So tab key leaves edit mode, and then we can select just this new object. Let's come over and change the name of this newly duplicated single vertex object. We'll call this stairs backbone. Let's move it out of the changing parts into the stairs collection because it's going to be its own object. We need to move it up now so that it is in the correct position, one stair level above what the current stair is. But you can see we've got this orange dot over here. That's the object's origin, and it needs to be in the same location as that single vertex. So we're going to come over to Object and then Set Origin to Geometry, and that'll get it into that position. Now let's press G key and then Z. We're going to type in 7.5 inches. That's the rise of the stair. Hit Return. The pivot is still down here locked onto the cursor. So I'm going to press period and I'm going to return it to the active object. And then once again, G key, Y in this case, 10.5 inches for the depth. And there we go. That's the correct position for one stair level. We have this single vertex that we now need to replicate a position for each of the steps so that we can use an object-on-object instance or duplication mechanism. So we need to use an array modifier for that. So let's come in now down to the modifiers, remove the subdivision modifier that came from the parent object, and let's add an array modifier. We're going to turn off relative offset and we're going to use constant offset. That's an absolute value. So X needs to be 0 and Y is the depth of the step, and that is 10.5 inches. And then for the Z, which is the rise of the step, it is 7.5 inches. There we go. So that is one step's distance. And we need to replicate that a number of times. I'm going to turn back on this reference for that mid-floor level, just so that we can make sure we get it right to the correct level. Let's type in 8, and that looks like it is correct. So that modifier has generated duplicates that are going to serve the next purpose for the object-on-object duplication mechanism. Now we just need to move the cursor into the correct position, which is the starting point for our stair backbone. Press Shift and S, cursor to selected, and then we select that single non-changing parts collection instance. Press Shift and S, and we're going to do selection to cursor, and it moves it to that location. Needs to be at the starting location. Now, take this non-changing parts collection instance, hold the Shift key, and we're going to parent that to the stairs backbone object. Nothing is initially going to happen. We need to come over to the object properties for it, down to instancing, and we're going to come over to vertex And look what happens. It creates an instance at each vertex location. So now it's time to replicate the actual stair, and this is the part that needs to have some variability to it, and it's a single object. So the best option for this is duplicate linked. But a very important key aspect of this is because we are going to be varying the texture on it, we need to come down to the material that's currently assigned to it. So if we look at this, the viewport, we can see that it already has a texture that I've set up on it. There's a little icon over here that if you don't know what it does, it gives you some great flexibility. It says data or object. There are just two options right here. And if you have a material applied at data level, all of the instances will be at the data level, and you can't change the texture in an independent way across all the instances. So this is where you need to come over and change this to object. This will allow you to independently apply materials to all of the instances of this particular object. Now we come over and let's come into the left view, and we just need to replicate these. These are already sitting inside of our changing parts collection. Press Option D, duplicate linked, and then Z, and then 7.5 inches to get the exact value. And then just Shift R till we get all of the repeated objects in place. Each one are independent, but they're all linked back to the original. Then we take all of these and we just need to move them G, Y, and then 10.5 as the value. And then select the next set up. I need to make sure and only get the steps. Shift R, and just keep doing this with Shift R until you get them to place. It's very easy. So this is one of the places where a little bit of manual work is required, but now we have all of these set up with the same texture, but they're prepared in such a way that we can apply independent materials. So we need to apply different materials to this. I've basically created 5 variations of this wood material. Let's come over to the shader setup here and take a look at this. So when we zoom in and we look at the material properties, so I've got stairs wood 05 is my starting point for all of these. And I've got a couple of bitmaps materials set up. The unfortunate thing is you've got to duplicate all of this 5 times, but this is where our flexibility comes in. You're going to note that in the mapping node is different than its default value of 0, 0, 0. So for instance, if I come in and I assign stairs wood 1, which was my starting point, the location has 0, 0, 0. Because this object is UV mapped, its UV map sits within inside of the UV space. And what the location map function does, X and Y, is it alters the U and the V position for the map. And it allows you to do it procedurally, so you don't have to manually go in and move it. So for instance, if we come in now and we select the next one up, the location is randomized, where I just sort of move the texture, and you can see that these two look different. So let's come up to the next one here, and let's change this one to stairs wood 3, and you can see that that changed. So for instance, if I came in here and I just manually moved this, you can see what it does. It allows you to change that position so that we get real nice randomization in the bitmap. The downside, again, is if you wanted to make a change to the core BRDF, you'd have to change that and then go copy that to each of the 5 materials. It's sort of the one aspect, the bummer aspect of this approach. Let's come here. Let's change the next one up. Let's go 4. I'll leave that one at 5. This one will come to 2. This one will do 1. And then we'll just kind of keep doing that up. And then that one will go to 3. So there we go. So now we have sort of this randomization. And if you find again that you think you'd like to change, then you would come over to this mapping node And then here's where you could change that. Looks like I'm only using 2 in one place, so I'll change this one to 2. That's how I approach this. But all of that work happened because I knew that duplicate linked gave me access to independent texturing abilities for the instances of the stair geometry. So it turns out there's a secondary way we could also do these steps that will give us the ability to use one texture but randomize the pattern using an array modifier. So I've got the single step, and I've got the position for the center at that same location that we've been using for the other elements. I'm going to come over to the modifiers. We can use a modifier because it's a single object. Let's add an array modifier like we had done for the bolts. But in this particular case, let me move it up top. We're not going to do relative. We're going to do constant offset. And we're going to do along the y-axis that 10.5 depth and the z 7.5. And then all we need to do is punch in a total of 10. And there we go. So we get the steps. Well, that was easy. In this particular case, we don't need to generate different textures, but we have clearly non-randomization. There's an easy pattern to see. So this is where we would come down to the UV entry for the array modifier, and you would just begin playing with these values. And look what it does, is it offsets each progressive instance, and then with the U, you just start playing with that, and you can play with the value until you get something that looks pretty random. And I think that would work pretty well for the purposes of randomizing that wood pattern. So there are usually multiple ways to achieve things in complex 3D applications like Blender. So the benefit of this, let's say that we came in, it was decided that a change needed to be made so that this support strut needed to be a little beefier. This is where I would come in and find the original. So it's selected here. Come over to the outliner and press the period key, and that will find the actual geometry for us. Tab key takes me into edit mode, and I'm in select box mode, so I can mark key across these. See, and then I can just pull that out, and it's all of those get replicated. That change gets replicated through all of those instances. Tab key, and then we could come in and we could decide if we wanted to replicate these over, for instance. And this method would allow us to duplicate these. So for instance, if I take this and do an Option D, X key, have to tap it twice to get that there. There we go. Then you can see I can duplicate those. They all happen inside of that bolts and struts, and all of that propagates. So this is the benefit of the method that we've chosen, and that also happens on the right side. So I hope you found this to be useful in terms of kind of understanding how to go about structuring scenes like this.